one of the things that we need to consider on this paper, as well as all the financial calculations that we have to do with regards to hedging and net present value calculations, etc., is generally just think about the ethics and the governance that need to be in place when running an organisation. Now, there are specific codes that we are going to look at. For example, in the UK, there are 3 main reports recommending best practice in corporate governance: the Cadbury report, the Greenberg report, and the Handel report. Now, all of this should be assumed knowledge from what you've done before on paper 1. However, you're unlikely to be asked any detailed questions on any of the rules laid out in these codes. What is so much more important on this paper is just look at it from a business point of view to see if there are any ethical issues that you need to consider, that shouldn't work like that. That director shouldn't have responsibility for that. Maybe we should think about our social and ethical responsibilities that are happening within the real world environment. So a little bit of common sense is going to go a lot further than being able to quote any specific rules and regulations. What we will do here, however, is talk through some of the main points of these codes to get a feel of what we mean when we're thinking about governance. First of all, the Cadbury report. The Cadbury Committee was originally set up in response to the occurrence of financial scandals in the 1980s involving UK-listed companies, which led to a fall in investor confidence in the quality of companies' financial reporting. The aim of the Cadbury report was to set up a code of practice. One of the problems that you fundamentally have is if people do not believe the financial statements that are being generated, it's got a massive reduction in investment into these businesses. Without these businesses cannot grow. So what the Cadbury report tried to do was set up this code of best practice so that people who invest in these companies had a little bit of faith in the people running these companies and the reports that were actually being generated. The main points of the report can be summarised as follows. First of all, the majority of the non-executive directors should be independent of management and free from any business or other relationships. So your non-executive directors should not be involved with any of the management of the day-to-day running of the overall business. They should also not be associated to the company by any of the business that they're operating in. What we're trying to get here is some non-executive directors who are truly independent to the overall business and will act in the best interest of everybody involved. Your non-executive directors should be appointed for specified terms, and your service contract should not exceed 3 years. What we're going to do here is try to keep people who aren't going to be tied into the business for a very long time, because once you are, then you may be potentially thinking about your own interest in being a director in this business for a long time. You set the term, which should be no longer than 3 years, and these directors should then be rotated to bring in fresh people who will be, hopefully, truly independent. Your executive remuneration should be subject to the recommendations of a remuneration committee made up entirely or mainly of non-executive directors. So the salary of the main board of directors should be determined by your non-executive directors, at least most of them be non-executive directors, to make sure that they are being paid a fair salary for the job they're actually doing in terms of giving shareholders back some wealth. Finally, an audit committee comprised at least 3 non-executive directors should be established. Obviously, what we're trying to do with the auditors is get an independent view that the company's financial statements represent the true position of this company. And by setting up an audit committee to liaise with your auditor, again, we're going for this independence so people can actually have faith in the reports actually being generated from the business. Now, the Greenberg report, during the 1990s, it was recognised that corporate governance issues relating to directors' remuneration needed to be addressed in a more rigorous manner. This led to the establishment of the Greenberg Committee, and the committee's findings were documented in the Greenberg report, which incorporated a code of best practice for directors' remuneration. So this isn't just really looking at the overall structure of the board and your executive directors and the audit committee and everything else that went with the Cadbury report. This is specifically looking at how directors are paid and how much they are paid for the work that they're actually doing. Again, the key points of the report can be listed as follows. The role of the Remuneration Committee in setting the remuneration packages for the CEO and the other directors. So a specific board should be set up to rigorously look at what these people are being paid and what they're being paid for. The required level of disclosure needed by shareholders regarding details of directors' remuneration and whether there is a need to obtain shareholders' approval. So they started to think about how much should we actually disclose within the financial statements about how much all of the directors are actually being paid. You can't just lump the whole thing together and call it salaries. You really need to show how many directors there are and how much each one is actually getting, and then also consider whether it should go to the shareholders to actually vote on the salaries that these directors are getting. You should have specific guidelines for determining a remuneration policy for your directors. So you can't just sit there and think, what should we give this person? We should have a clear set of rules and procedures that say, this is what we're going to pay people for if they do X, this is what we're going to give them if they hit this certain target, and have clear ideas and distinctions of what they have to do, what they can't not do in order to receive this money. Your service contracts and provisions binding the company to pay compensation to a director, particularly in the event of dismissal for unsatisfactory performance. Very topical in recent years with regards to the collapse of the banking system, etc., is the fact that very often these directors of these large institutions failed to meet their objectives. Very often companies collapsed or came very close to collapsing, and these directors still received a very large sum of money as a result of it. What we've got to try to do here is say, look, if you are not performing, then we have the right to remove you as the director of this business. This is very different to what you have as an employee of a business, because as an employee, if you're not doing the job properly, you're supposed to go through a whole procedure to try to bring you up to speed, and if you can't get up to speed and do it properly, then there's procedures in place to eventually remove you after a certain amount of time. But you don't really want that with a director. If the director isn't good enough, the director is leading the business, you can't give them the chance to develop and get better. You might just want to remove them, and as such, they're going to have to be paid some sort of compensation package to take them out. And all of that needs to be detailed very, very clearly as disclosed by this report. Now, the Handball report, the committee was established in 1996 to review and revise the earlier recommendations of the Cadbury and Greenbury committees. The final report emphasises principles of good governance rather than explicit rules. What they eventually came to the conclusion with this was you can't prescribe that you have to do X, Y and Z within a company and hope that applies to every single company. What you do instead is lay down guidelines. This is what we should try to achieve, keeping in mind that this company is owned by the shareholders and we have a duty to act in their best interests. Governance should be viewed as an opportunity to enhance long-term shareholder value. So you should always be acting in a way that's going to be in the best interest of the shareholders in the long term. Therefore, we must always be looking to make sure there's no loopholes for people to create fraudulent activities. You must always be doing stuff that's going to be long-term gain as opposed to some sort of short-term profitability. The board has identified as having responsibility to maintain a sound system of internal control and accountable all aspects of risk management as opposed to just the financial controls as recommended by Cadbury. So what we're looking at here isn't just to make sure that our financial statements are correct, but we need to put controls in place to make sure the whole business can run smoothly, and there are controls in place to make sure that nothing is going to slip through the fence, etc., making sure that everything works well. So in summary, we have these different types of governance laid out by these reports. All we're thinking about is looking at an organisation and thinking, is this going to operate in the best interest of the shareholders? Do we have a position where somebody has too much authority? Do we have a position where somebody's being asked to do something that's not in the best interest of the company? Are we leaving ourselves exposed to unnecessary risks? You cannot have a prescribed list of rules that you have to look for in every single question. Or if there's there, that's a problem. If that's not there, that's going to be a problem. You have to take a much more holistic view on this sort of ideas of governance and look at the situation and think if you think there are any potential pitfalls that could lead to problems for the company overall.